Hello, this is MXA News. Have you called a Democrat a communist and get confused when they deny it? Have you ever tried calling a communist a liberal and wonder why they're foaming at the mouth? Well, it's not entirely your fault.
But we need to take stock of why we're being held hostage to the far left.
The violent leftists.
Biden's radical left-wing transformation of our military.
Now in the process of defeating the radical left.
Witnesses say last weekend in Charlottesville, some who joined peaceful counter-protesters were as violent as the radical right.
We have been conditioned to think that Democrats are somehow this radical left-wing organization, all for the crime of advocating for regulation and moderation against capitalism. To fervent capitalists, this is radical. Any regulation is radical. In the right-wing orthodoxy, those who own corporations and businesses have every right to make our homes their playground or resort if they see fit. But let's go over this on the difference between left-wing and right-wing ideology. Let's start with what we do know. In the United States, we are under the umbrella ideology of neoliberalism, covered by Democrats and Republicans. The Republicans, who believe in capitalism, strong borders, religious liberty, smaller government interventions, and a stronger police and military. The Democrats, who also believe in capitalism.
So, capitalism in its best form is about beauty of competition to create the greatest product, to create the greatest outcome.
Folks, it turns out capitalism is alive and very well. We're making serious progress to ensure that it works the way it's supposed to work.
There's a reason why I came to a business school instead of a school of government. I actually believe that capitalism is the greatest force for prosperity and opportunity the world has ever known. And I believe in private enterprise, not government.
A strong presence overseas, acting as the world police, funding the local police despite incidents like George Floyd, and now a stronger border, and very flimsy dedication to minority voices.
You know what? If you want Donald Trump to win, then say that, otherwise I'm speaking.
Yet, despite the paradigm of the Republicans versus the Democrats tend to be more sympathetic to those outcasted by the white-dominated politics and conservatism. Both parties serve the interest of capital. Michael R. Bloomberg donated over $43 million to the Democrats and $1 million to the Republicans. Reed Garrett Hoffman donated over $26 million to the Democrats and $400,000 to the Republicans. Mark Andreessen donated over $1 million to the Democrats and over $6 million to the Republicans. If we break it down by organization, the National Association of Realtors donated over $4 million to the Democrats and over $6 million to the Republicans. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee donated over $20 million to the Democrats and over $12 million to the Republicans. Coinbase donated over $4 million to the Democrats and just under $3 million to the Republicans. If we break these donations down by ideology, we'll see that many of them donate between Democrats and Republicans. However, the industry that donates may vary between parties. For example, security investment companies donating just $200 million to the Democrats while donating over $180 million to the Republicans. Real estate firms donating over $110 million to the Democrats and over $125 million to the Republicans. Airlines donating over $14 million to the Democrats and over $19 million to the Republicans. I present this data to say this: if you think that the Democrats are in any position to launch a socialist or a communist revolution, it's not realistic. The Democrats might be incompetent, but they're not that incompetent. Their incompetence is from our perspective, which stems from the fact that their service is not to the people, but to capital interest. To capital interest, it is as Biden says.
We're making serious progress to ensure that it works the way it's supposed to work.
When capital is allowed to purchase elections, like what we see here, these politicians are not in a position to tell them no, even if they wanted to. Bernie Sanders, who's still fairly popular, gets chastised by the establishment Democrats like Nancy Pelosi and the rest of the party. His push for populist socialism is met with condescension.
Bernie Sanders has not won. Let me, with all due respect, and I have a great deal of respect for him, for what he stands for, but I don't respect him saying that the Democratic Party has abandoned the working class families.
Of course, it isn't realistic to expect change when we continue allowing capital interests to buy out the parties. The Democrats are bought and paid for. The Republicans are as well, even though they insist they're not.
Here's a guy that buys a house for $179,000. He sells it to a lobbyist who's probably here for $380,000, and then legislation is passed. You tell me about this guy. That's all of his donors and special interests out there. So that's what it is. That's what. And by the way, let me just tell you, we needed tickets. You can't get them. You know who has the tickets for the? I'm talking about to the television audience. Donors, special interests, the people that are putting up the money. So it is. The RNC told us we have all donors in the audience, and the reason they're not loving me, the reason they're not loving me is I don't want their money. I'm going to do the right thing for the American public. I don't want their money. I don't need their money. And I'm the only one up here that can say that.
Both conservative and liberal ideologies fall under the umbrella ideology of neoliberalism, an ideology solidified by the likes of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who were vehemently against socialism, public projects, and exclusively advocated for private interests, property ownership, and deregulation, whittling down the government so that corporations could acquire more. But then you might ask, how do you convince people to willingly give away state-owned assets to a corporation? One way to do it is purposely mismanaging them. Under Reagan's administration, he asked Congress to cut the post office subsidy from $500 million to $119 million. This meant that all the services that the post office offered, they would have to do so with a $119 million budget instead of the $500 million that they had. Slowly but surely, Reagan degraded the use and value of the USPS, which meant that the service would be getting worse. Employees were getting paid less, quality of service was decreasing, and the department's capabilities drastically shrunk, which added to the narrative that state-owned assets were ineffective compared to their privately owned competitors. This continued through the Clinton administration and all the way into today's politics, where Trump floats the idea of privatizing the National Weather Service and potentially Veterans Affairs and Healthcare. You can refer to the Republican Party on retirement in one of my articles. Whether it's through Trump, Reagan, Clinton, Obama, it's like Biden says. Any policy passed by either red or blue party, it is written, reviewed, and approved by corporations that donate. With the system in place by our corporate government, any bill passed will never threaten the status quo while the corporations approve. And if you think corporations are capable of sustaining a moral compass, may I remind you of the unholy amount of corporations that sponsored the Holocaust. But now let's get to that scary word that Reagan's ghost haunts us with: socialism. It is correct to say that you cannot have socialism without communism. Socialism is a transitionary stage from capitalism to communism, because communism cannot be applied immediately. It's not realistic. It's why Lenin and Stalin applied the new economic plan, because people needed time to adapt to the new system of production upcoming. Declaring a law does not make it so. You need to give all of society a chance to adapt and overcome the hardships, and to get ready for the new world going forward. It's also why organizations like the CIA use violent paramilitaries to remove groups they deem problematic, i.e., unions and socialists. When capital interests wants an immediate private ownership and unions and socialists posing opposition to that, violence might be the quicker answer than negotiation. And if you think this doesn't apply domestically, it does. While the CIA and the police might not directly punish you for dissent, corporations are given the right to union bust, immigrants are screened to ensure they weren't associated with communist organizations, and not to mention the 1954 Bill Against Communism. And as per the violent interactions,
come all of you good workers, good news to you I'll tell, of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? My daddy was a miner and I'm a miner's son, and I'll stick with the Union till every battle's won. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? They say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair.
But let's get to the root of it. Socialism is a transition from private property to state property. The privately owned properties, houses, businesses, farms, factories, etc., are transitioned to state ownership. The state is the entity that's supposed to represent the people. In a capitalist-friendly socialism, or democratic socialism, the government acts as the regulatory body while corporations are still allowed to cooperate, but only under certain parameters. A lot of people think of the Nordic model of socialism as this model. However, many leftists criticize the system. Is it because they're a bunch of ungrateful people who want more welfare? Not exactly. It's because while you allow capitalism to operate, it might have to operate under the rules of your house, but it doesn't stop them from operating under the rules of another house. For example, the Global Child Forum assessed 299 companies from the Nordic region. 73% of the companies have a child labor policy, however, only 10% of them report instances of child exploitation, and only 7% of these instances are included in their reports, and only 12% take action against child labor. The International Labor Organization reports that over 21 million people are trapped in forced labor, slavery. 90% of this labor contributes to the supply line of these companies. While the Nordic regions enjoy a welfare state and higher wages, this doesn't account for the fact that their economy is powered by exploitations from overseas. This is the issue that many leftists have with democratic socialism.
Initially, post-World War II, a grand rebuilding of Europe, combined with the sheer popularity of socialist forces, both in the form of political parties in France, Italy, etc., as well as the influence of then-existing socialist nations such as the USSR, with its full employment, free healthcare, education, extensive social benefits, amongst all the rest, resulted in a choice for the ruling classes of the re-emerging European nations. Either they acquiesce to the general demands represented by socialist forces without giving up their power, or risk losing power through revolution mixed with popular electoral action. They picked the former, and so was European social democracy born. Of course, unlike in socialist countries, social democratic countries supported their social programs through neo-colonial, imperialist, and otherwise exploitative relations with the economic periphery, which today runs to the level of over $10 trillion, if you can believe it. If you're interested in the details, check out my unequal exchange video here. That point is incredibly important. In European social democracies, all those safety nets are paid for through less than pleasant means and off the backs of the Third World. Britain and France were massive imperial powers that built their wealth on the destruction of indigenous industry, colonial taxes, the direct theft of the areas and peoples they've subjugated, and ongoing neo-colonial exploitation through 1,000 methods. Even those countries that didn't have direct empires still exploit the imperial periphery via insidious trade policies and illicitly got an ownership stake in Third World natural resources. Companies in social democratic countries take advantage of cheap immigrant labor at home and cheap imperial periphery labor abroad. They rely on market preference via IMF restructuring of third world economies that puts the core, the first world, an advantage over the periphery.
It's wonderful, and it's great to make life better in domestic policy. But the question remains, when are we going to eliminate exploitation in every place possible? As long as you allow these corporations to go overseas and exploit another country's refusal to enforce labor-friendly regulations, we're doing nothing to solve the problem. We're just putting it somewhere else. Then you might ask, well, why shouldn't the corporations take advantage of other countries? If they allow them to pay the employees lower wages, why does that matter to us? In order to sustain such a system, we have to spend trillions on military and intelligence assets to ensure such an advantage. If we allowed countries the legitimate right of self-determination, and not the caveats that the US and Europe like to attach, many nations would choose better working conditions for their employees. It's been proven if you read the history of the CIA alone. The amount of countries they've intervened in just to ensure that left-wing politics doesn't gain any traction. Because if socialism was allowed to take a foothold in any country, corporations could not go to those places to take advantage. If the global south decides that enough is enough and CIA interventions aren't as effective as they used to be, that oppression and intervention will eventually come back here. Because those with capital believe in infinite growth in a finite world. Those with capital cannot extrapolate value from the multipolar world growing right now. That will come back here, where their entitlement will conflict with their unwillingness to relent. When democratic socialism proves to be inadequate for eliminating exploitation, it's escalated to communism, where the people will own the assets. The idea of socialism is that a state confiscates private property from the capitalists so that they might be communally owned. Homes are no longer private property, they are considered personal property and a human right. I would check out Our Russian Ally by Vera Michele's Dean to highlight the policy application of homes being personal property, and that would be considered state property. The Soviet economic system has been the subject of such bitter controversy that we must try to look at it today as calmly as we can if we want to get a fairly accurate picture. Russia is not, and has not been the past quarter century, the economic and social utopia pictured by some pro-Soviet writers in the United States. On the other hand, it has not been the unrelieved hell compounded of brutality and inefficiency painted by anti-Soviet writers. It has been a vast, churned up, yeasty mixture of good and bad, of achievements and failures, of aspirations for the better things of life and attempts to attain them by violent shortcuts. These shortcuts involve much cruelty towards individuals who, for one reason or another, stood in the way or opposed certain practices. Often the results were wastage of lives, talents, and material, but also remarkable success in achieving the industrialization of a relatively backward nation. We must look back at Russia's history and remember that before 1917, ownership of private property by individuals was far less widespread than in the United States or the countries of Western Europe. Russia only had a small middle class, wedged between the monarchy and the aristocracy at the top, and the vast masses of poor peasants and underprivileged factory workers at the bottom. In Western countries, the presence of a middle class, constantly replenished from the ranks of workers and peasants, served to cushion the shock of revolutionary movements in the 19th and 20th century. Because Russia had only a new and weak middle class in 1917, it could not make an orderly change from absolutist monarchy to a political system similar to that of Britain, the United States, or Republican France. When capitalism was suppressed by the Soviet government in 1917, therefore, it was not the far-reaching and fundamental change in the country's economic system that a similar change would be in the United States. The relatively few members of the aristocracy and the rising middle class were deprived of all property and couldn't be used in productive enterprises. Many of them were driven into exile, executed, or imprisoned. For the individuals involved, these things were tragic. We will be glossing over human cruelty to forget this, but the vast masses of people in Russia were not much affected by the change. They only knew the property formerly owned by the monarchy, the aristocracy, the church, the very small middle class, and the big landowners became the property of the Soviet state. And the Kremlin has always been careful to point out to the people that they are the state, and therefore it is now they who now collectively, if indirectly, own Russia's forests, fields, mines, and factories. The Kremlin has also impressed on the people that they must never permit these resources to pass into the hands of individuals or groups of individuals uncontrolled by the state. And let's keep this in mind, this was a publication approved and distributed by the US government to lower tensions between Allied and Soviet soldiers. And now we continue. But how can these opportunities for advancement amount to such, some people ask? If extra earnings cannot be translated into property, for the abolition of capitalism in Russia has been taken by many Americans to mean that the Russians cannot own any personal property whatever. That is not true. The Soviet leaders draw a sharp distinction between ownership of capital for private gain and ownership of various forms of personal property, houses, books, domestic utensils, clothes, furniture, automobiles, and the like, for private use. What a Russian cannot do is accumulate money from his wages, put his money into a private enterprise or even a small shoe shop or stationery store, and then hire people to work for him as an individual. This is strictly forbidden. Everyone is encouraged to save his money, however, and deposit it in a government banks or buy government securities. The financial resources thus accumulated are managed solely by the state and are invested by it in various enterprises, from steel mills and tractor factories to the stores in which people buy their shoes, clothes, and furniture. In other words, businesses are built, managed, and owned by the state. However, the state is owned by the people. Then you might argue, if the Soviet system is a good idea for some leftists, why did it collapse in 1991? We have to remember that there is vested interest in the downfall of socialist projects. To this day, Cuba is still blockaded even when the UN expresses disapproval as such. Western media exclusively criticizes China's economy without nuance, and any sentiment right of center is lambasted for even daring to consider an alternative, insisting that capitalism is the only way to go, despite the misery caused by it. Is this the furthest left you can go? No. It runs much deeper. Once you transition from socialism to communism, the means of production are now at an equilibrium, or are they? What if the state decides that the people are no longer to be trusted? What if bureaucracies decide that they should hold all the power and fight the people at every opportunity, preserving the way of the old guard against newer ideas of revolution? My friend, that is anarchism. Anarchy has a distorted definition more so than communism. At least with communism, you can get to the necessary distinction between private property and the means of production. Many conversations don't even come close to the problem the ideology wishes to address, which is the state's susceptibility to corruption. While the democratic petty bourgeois wants to bring the revolution to an end as quickly as possible, achieving at most the aims already mentioned, it is our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent until all the more or less property classes have been driven from their ruling positions, until the proletariat have conquered state power, and until the association of proletarians have progressed sufficiently far, not only in one country but in all the leading countries of the world. The competition between the proletarians of this country ceases, and at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated in the hands of the workers. In other words, the revolution isn't over until every worker has control of their means of production, not controlled by the state, not controlled by a capitalist, but rather by the person. Then you might ask, hold up, isn't that what capitalism is? No. Capitalism gives you the power of money to control others. Through capitalism, you are allowed to undermine or overstep people with the power of capital. You are allowed to acquire, whether coercively or cooperatively, vast sums of private property and corner the market. Left-wing ideology doesn't leave room for such play. Left-wing ideology aims to combat this subversive element and allow the individual to do with their labor as they like, not to be coerced by the state or capitalist. The difference is that socialism still retains some aspects of capitalism. Communism eliminates capitalism entirely. Anarchy eliminates the state. The highest form of left-wing ideology is to eliminate all opportunities of exploitation. Though there is a spirited debate between communists and anarchists on the necessity of the state. And where does that leave fascism? Discussed neoliberalism, leftism, and now we're on fascism. Remember when I mentioned the rules of corporate exploitation coming back home? In the event that capitalists can't exploit enough overseas, fascism is what happens when the capitalists find ways to exploit people domestically. state-sanctioned actions against left-wing sentiment at home, fascism rose as a response to the militant labor that grew from post-World War I. In Italy, for example, the Blackshirts were an organization formed to protect businesses as laborers got more militant with their employers. Socialism took Italy by storm after World War I. Realizing that kings and industries were the reason for their involvement in the war, the people rose up and took their government back from the monarchy. The Blackshirts, in contrast, were established to combat socialists in any movement they were involved in. And what did business interests in the US think of these developments? What did Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds have to say about such? Italian fascism and German Nazism had their admirers within the US business community and corporate-owned press. Bankers, publishers, and industrialists, including the likes of Henry Ford, traveled to Rome and Berlin to pay homage, receive medals, and strike profitable deals. Many did their utmost to advance the Nazi war effort, sharing military-industrial secrets and engaging in secret transactions with the Nazi government even after the United States entered the war. During the 1920s and early 1930s, major publications like Fortune, The Wall Street Journal, Saturday Evening Post, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and Christian Science Monitor hailed Mussolini as the man who rescued Italy from anarchy and radicalism. They spun rhapsodic fantasies of a resurrected Italy where poverty and exploitation had suddenly disappeared, where the Reds had been vanquished, harmony reigned, the Blackshirts protected a new democracy. The Italian language press in the United States eagerly joined the chorus. The two most influential newspapers, Vitalia of San Francisco, financed largely by A.R. Giannini's Bank of America, and Second Progresso of New York, owned by multimillionaire Generoso Pope, looked favorably on the fascist regime and suggested that the United States could benefit from a similar social order. Some dissenters refused to join the We Adore Benito chorus. The Nation reminded its readers that Mussolini was not saving democracy, but destroying it. Progressives of all stripes and various labor leaders denounced fascism, but their critical sentiments received little exposure in the US corporate media. As with Mussolini, so with Hitler, the press did not look too unkindly upon the Führer's Nazi dictatorship. There was a strong give Adolf a chance contingent, some of it greased by Nazi money. In exchange for more positive coverage in the Hertz newspapers, for instance, the Nazis paid almost 10 times the standard subscription rate for Hearst's INS wire service. In return, William Randolph Hearst instructed his correspondents in Germany to file friendly reports about Hitler's regime. Those who refused were transferred or fired. Hearst's newspapers even opened their pages to occasional guest columns by prominent Nazi leaders like Alfred Rosenberg or Hermann Göring. By the mid to late 1930s, Italy and Germany, allied with Japan, another industrial latecomer, were aggressively seeking a share of the world's markets and colonial booty, an expansionism that brought them increasingly into conflict with more established Western capitalist nations like Great Britain, France, and the United States. As the clouds of war gathered, US press opinion about the Axis powers took on a decisively critical tone. But then you might ask, how do you spot fascism? Is it just swastikas and black shirts? Is it anti-Semitism? Is it a dictator? There are many surface-level observations that can be a sign of fascism, but how do you truly define it? In Umberto's 14 Points of Fascism, he defines it as: Number 1, a cult of tradition. This tends to be obsessions with the good old days. When the Nazis took over, Hitler emphasized a disgrace and a denial of glory by other nations during the First World War. They emphasized how things were better in the old days, and if elected, they promised to bring those days back. Number 2, rejection of modernism. This comes as a rejection of modern culture, science, and philosophy, a school of anti-philosophical thought that degrades other schools of thought as a degeneration of classic or traditional values. It emphasizes how some ideologies or philosophies began the decline of certain values. In fact, I did write an article about a modern-day example of such. Action for action's sake. Do without thinking. This benefits people who want you to shoot first and ask questions later, degrading thought as an emasculation. You must be willing to act and do not let second thought delay you. By this rule, you should never think about the implications and discourage those who do. Which brings me to the fourth point. Disagreement is treason. In no way, shape, or form are you allowed to disagree with the leader of the party. No criticism, no bad press. You will unconditionally support every action and every statement to be taken by our leaders. The critical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. In modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. Number 5, fear of difference. Lack of conformity should be broached with hostility. This includes gender, sexuality, religion, race. There is no end to what must conform to the standard set by your ruling party. 6, an appeal to social frustration. Fascists do not usher themselves by promising the elimination or extermination of a race or people. The sales pitch, the fascist foot in the door, is to say, I understand where you're coming from. Eggs and gas are expensive. Why are we in these endless wars? Why is Washington, D.C. flooded with these career politicians? By appealing to the frustration of your average person, the person speaking on these frustrations wins more credibility than the person who pretends the problems do not exist. Number 7, an obsession with a plot. It's not enough that these politicians and modernists are degrading our way of life. This isn't just a spontaneous development. There has to be a greater and villainous plot to destroy our way of life. What else would explain such wretched conditions for you, the American? Thus, men like Hitler and Ford appealed to anti-Semitism, the conspiracy that Jewish capitalists undermined Germany during the war and manipulate society into a degenerative lifestyle of poverty and barbarism. Or as Trump might put, the large hordes of migrants from all sorts of countries that come over the border and eat your household pets. This is effective because he's no longer just targeting one demographic like he did in 2016. Now he is targeting Haitians, Muslims, and any group that the white suburbanite voter might fear. Number 8, the enemy is both weak and strong. While the enemy is strong enough to overcome borders, entire governments, and corporations, they are subversive and weak people that try to undermine you, the strong protagonists of the story they're trying to sell you. Because doom and gloom only goes so far. Instead of bombarding you with bad news, they give you the good news that you, the Ubermensch, or the red-blooded Christian American, are strong enough to overcome these weak and overwhelming hordes of enemies. Which, in a modern context, boils down to bigotry against non-conforming groups. While difference normally targets behavior, this 8th principle targets appearance and origin. Number 9, pacifism is aiding the enemy. Refusal to join the fight is seen as treason. It isn't enough to just agree. It isn't enough to stand out of the way. To the fascists, you must also join or become their enemy. If you'd like to know how far this trend goes, see what happened to Berlin in 1945. Not even children were spared from the continuing war effort. Number 10, contempt for the weak. If the person can't fight because of a disability, they are seen as undesirable, useless to the war apparatus. If they cannot contribute, they will have no part in the future going forward. See the T4 programs to see this placed in the application. Number 11, everyone is a hero. Remember when I said that inspiration was a key factor in fascism? Everyone within the regime is a hero. You must be willing to lay your life for the future of the regime, no matter how dire things get. Again, refer to Berlin in 1945 to see how far this goes. 12. Machismo and weaponry. A man's ability to procreate is tied to his ability to fight. A man of war is peak performance of masculinity, and any who try to deviate should be considered filth, according to the fascist. Any nonconformity to this standard should be viewed with disgust and purged in order to move forward. See Germany's burning of Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Research that J.K. Rowling tries so hard to deny. Number 13, selective populism. There is in our future a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. Number 14, newspeak.
You gotta remember, I don't want to say this because they say it's braggadocious.
All the Nazi or fascist school books made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. So overall, What we have today is neoliberalism, a sustainment of capitalism between both liberal and conservative parties that may or may not differ that much on systems that work to sustain the system of capital. Socialism is the transitionary stage from capitalism to communism, while anarchism acts as the challenging ideology to states that may or may not sustain a populist will. Fascism is the reaction to left-wing sentiment threatening to undermine the capitalist status quo, adopting a militant stance that cracks down against nonconformity, the furthest to the right you can reach. And if you like what I did, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to check out my Patreon, and also feel free to check out my Medium and other platforms that I publish on. Thank you so much, and remember to keep fighting the good fight.